Good evening and welcome to the Old Colony Budget Subcommittee meeting of February 10th, 2021. We'd like to take a moment to let everyone know that this meeting is being live streamed on Facebook at the Old Colony Facebook page. Additionally, we'd like to take a quick moment to recognize those who are in attendance. Our Budget Subcommittee Chair, Maurice Saint-Amand from the town of Acushnet, from the town of Carver, Mr. Don Williams, from the town of Lakeville, Robert Marshall, from the town of Mattapoisett, Richard Gamache, from the town of Rochester, Shirley Burke, our principal, Mr. John Michael Parker, our secretary to the school committee and assistant to the superintendent director, Jolene Costa, and our business manager, Sarah Griffith. I'm Aaron Polanski, Superintendent Director, and at this point in time, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Mr. Saint-Amand. Thank you.
We'll call the meeting to order, and actually we're going to dispense with the pledge to the flag because we're all on remote, I believe. And we're going to turn this right over to Sarah. Got all this paperwork for us.
Sorry about that. I don't know if everyone got the updated presentation for tonight, but I will share my screen in case.
Mo, can I interrupt just for a second?
Sure.
Sure.
I just want to make a comment in case we're so fatigued by the end of this that it gets missed somewhere along the line. The last few weeks since the release of the governor's budget have been pretty intense, and you will hear why shortly with the many surprises that came to us. And I just want to commend both Sarah and Aaron on all of the work that they have done in the last few weeks to come up with the proposals that they are bringing forward. Things did not work out as we had anticipated, and I think that's a brief understatement. But that did not diminish the work that was done, and I would just want to get my kudos into both of them. And now, Sarah, you can jump into it.
Okay.
So we're going to focus tonight on FY22. We're going to start with the state aid released on January 27th by DESE, and then move into FY22 budget scenarios. So again, I'll share my screen to get everybody on at the same page. Start with Chapter 70 funding.
Excuse me, Sarah, is this the latest update that we're looking at?
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So we'll start with Chapter 70 summary spreadsheet. The most important thing really about the Chapter 70 is that Old Colony received minimum aid in Chapter 70, which is $30 per pupil. So you can see on the left side of the calculation sheet that is the Chapter 70 spreadsheet from DESE that Old Colony received the minimum $30 per pupil increase for a total of $14,940. So that is the first piece to our puzzle of FY22's budget. You can see here, foundation enrollment went up 31 students. Our foundation budget increased. Our required district contribution increased, so the minimum local contribution. And then you can see our Chapter 70 aid increase here on this sheet. So that's the first piece to next year. Okay. Let's go to the next page. If anyone has any questions on that, we can discuss it. But if not, we'll go to the next page.
Sarah, before we move off this page, can I just add the comment of the surprise that was, I think somewhere along the line when we thought about the loss of Freetown revenue for their tuition revenue, we anticipated that our Chapter 70 would go up more than the minimum aid. And when I saw this for the first time, I was taken aback that
Yes.
we could pick up 31 students and only receive an additional not quite $15,000 in Chapter 70 monies.
Right.
That
so
was
there
one of the first
basically-
surprises, and I don't think any of us anticipated that in the initial preparations of the budget.
No, that is one of the major shifts from our December meeting. When I was preparing the budget numbers for Chapter 70, I used a per pupil estimate on the foundation aid that we receive for the pupils in the building. And that is not what we received. Basically, we did not receive any additional foundation funding from the state, and rather the minimum of the $30 per pupil. And instead, really, the shift went to the required minimum local contribution from our member towns. As you can see, it's a very large increase of $778,000.
Sarah, I appreciate what you're saying, but I think it should also be observed that the exercise you did when you established our first proposals was what we have been doing all along. And that, again, it was a surprise to see the shift in the local contributions that the state is telling us, no, that didn't work, that logic didn't work, and that the shift needs to go to the communities who all have apparently a greater ability to pay.
Yes, which I thought maybe we could get into a little bit more on the next page when we talk about minimum local contribution. It's a very important piece of this for sure.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, Sarah or Aaron, were other schools treated in this fashion, or is Old Colony, is this unique to Old Colony?
Several schools throughout the state saw similar impacts. We looked further into statistics pertaining to enrollment growth, foundation enrollment growth. Once we received this information, we actually had several meetings with the Department of Education and also some legislators. But I will tell you that there were 42 schools in the Commonwealth that saw enrollment growth. Of the 42 schools, 4 schools saw over 5% growth in enrollment. We were one of those 4 schools in the Commonwealth that saw growth of over 5% in our foundation. And that number was actually 6.6% that we saw. What the state told, well, I'll leave it at that for now, Bob. And yes, throughout the Commonwealth, many schools have experienced this. Sarah will speak a little bit further to some of what we heard from the state as she proceeds.
I may be jumping the gun here, but are these figures done? No way of getting state to make changes?
There'll be not to Chapter 70. There will not be changes to Chapter 70 that I would anticipate having any drastic impact on what we're looking at tonight, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So the next form that is important is the minimum local contribution. That is our starting point for the statutory method for assessment to our member towns. There were a couple of things that, came to my attention when first looking at these forms on January 27th. The first, obviously, the very large increase to our member town minimum local contribution. The second is the enrollment. Because the numbers that we had in December, which are the Old Colony enrollment numbers for the pupils attending Old Colony, and the numbers on this spreadsheet differ. So we reached out to Desi, Mr. Plansky, spoke with Desi, and discovered that we have 3 school choice students this year, which is why we have an increase in our enrollment for foundation over what we had in December. We did discover one it appears to be a clerical error, data entry error with Lakeville, and Lakeville's number was always and should have been 137 even when we were working in December. So the 3 school choice children are 1 school choice from Carver, which changed Carver's enrollment by 1, and 2 students from Mattapoisett. So instead of 42 students, there are 44 on this sheet. We'll get into the why on school choice in the next slide.
Okay.
So for now, we'll focus on the minimum local contribution. When Mr. Plansky and I met with Desi, what we were told was, because our member town local enrollment at their elementary schools and or middle schools has decreased, the state has assessed their ability to pay to be more for this fiscal year, FY22, the budget we're building. And that is what we were told is the reason why Old Colony did not receive additional state aid.
Wow.
That makes little or no sense.
So basically, Sarah, did they tell us a cumulative increase in foundation enrollment for our sending districts? I believe it was of 344 students.
Yes, you're a little bit hard to hear. Yes, it was 344 students member town wide. So in our 5 member towns, there is a local decline in enrolled students in public schools of 344 students, which is why, according to our meeting with Desi, there was a large shift in the member town's assessment of their ability to pay versus Old Colony's funding of Chapter 78.
Wow.
And so we had a very open, honest, candid conversation with Desi, and we pulled some of our member town Chapter 70 enrollment data. Take a look at what happened in Acushnet, what happened in Lakeville, and what I said in the meeting with Aaron and Desi is just because a member town loses students enrolled in their public school system doesn't mean that equals a cut to the budget. And we've seen this happen time and time again. Those two don't necessarily correlate to being equal. You know, if you lose 30 students in a member town elementary school, you don't necessarily, that doesn't necessarily mean you can remove a teacher from the budget. Those two things don't always happen. So that's
Well, in an elementary school, it very commonly does.
it could.
Sure,
It
but
could.
to that point, Bob, if you think about it, let's just call it a K through 5 elementary.
Sure.
If you have multiple kindergarten classes, multiple, you know, and let's say that spread of, call it 25 students,
Yeah.
or 30, is 5 per grade. The impacts are a lot different than if it were 30 per grade.
Right.
So all they're looking at is, let's say, we'll take one town, for example, that loses,
Yeah.
and we won't name a town, we'll just say, we have a town that lost 87 students.
There you go.
Foundation
Perfect.
enrollment. That particular town that spread of 87 students could be anywhere from K
Any
to
grade.
12, right?
Gotcha.
The reality is that doesn't necessarily mean that that town would cut their budget. And so their ability to think that their ability to pay is increased by the differentials that have been created is what we struggled with. And that's where our calls.
And is that what Desi was saying? Because we had this drop across the district in grade 8, that the funding should be.
It's
not grade 8.
It's K through 12. So if a town's foundation enrollment, and again, Sarah, correct me at any point if I misstate, but if a town's foundation enrollment drops and our enrollment goes up, they're viewing that as just a basic shift of funds. They're saying that their ability to pay, Old Colony, is greater because they have fewer students in their foundation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
But as we know with this pandemic, the trickle of students is not specifically to one grade. We didn't have, it's not, oh, the 4th graders, didn't enroll in school this year and then said they're going to private school or they're picking a Catholic school. That's not what happened. It was this little kind of trickle of, there's certain, like Aaron just said, they could be 5 from each grade. It doesn't necessarily equal a class. So our argument was like, this causes tension now between Old Colony and our member towns local because we're fighting over the same funds basically. And for Old Colony, to be fair to Old Colony, we did have a large increase in our foundation enrollment. And that is one of the conversations we had with our member town stakeholders, town administrators, FinCom members. If we see this shift, it is going to mean that we're going to need a higher assessment from our member towns. What's not fair is the ramifications of the local losing enrollment doesn't necessarily equal ability to give Old Colony additional funding, therefore no need for aid. That was the first really big surprise. We did not receive additional Chapter 70 aid for the students. That increased our member enrollment, our foundation enrollment that were, for all intents and purposes, Freetown graduating students that we replaced with member town students. Second really big surprise was the increase in minimum local contribution being very, very high. Third surprise, and we'll get to them right now, are the school choice children. And this is an important conversation because school choice students affect Old Colony's Chapter 70. I want to show you the correlation of these two numbers so you can understand why our revenue number is what it is. So as you can see from the cherry sheet from the governor's proposed budget is Chapter 70 starts at the $3.297 million. Then they give us what we will get for regional transportation reimbursement from the state. And the last piece is the school choice sending tuition. And when you look here at the bottom, you see the net receipts. That is the Old Colony revenue that will be transferred from DESE. First piece. You can see, Mr. Bob, I can see your eyes twisting. You're on mute. I want to hear what you say, though.
I said, I'm not a math major, but somehow that doesn't quite add up.
Well, the second piece to this is the way school choice sending students. Now, this isn't receiving, Old Colony isn't getting them. They are children who reside in our member towns who are choosing a Chapter 74 program at in a different town.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the way DESE assesses and collects the tuition for this is through Chapter 70. So
Whoa.
they tell you how much money you're going to receive in Chapter 70, and then they tell you how much money they're going to take from your Chapter 70, giving you at the end of the day your net receipts. It's very important when we build our budget that we use the net receipts, because otherwise we are saying we're going to receive a revenue that we are not going to receive. It gets more complicated. And this is why
Swell.
we're only talking about FY22 today, because we can't talk about anything else because we will all be glazed over. The next piece is the reason DESE adds the kids in the minimum local contribution foundation aid.
Excuse me, Sarah, these aren't from the latest attachment that you sent latest this afternoon. This is from the one you sent yesterday, right?
This is from the new one. This is from the one I sent this afternoon.
Okay.
I just went back to page 2.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Because I want to show you these kids one more time. I want you to be able to connect the why the assessment sheet looks the way it does. We're going to get to the assessment sheet. Okay. The reason DESE adds the students to the foundation enrollment is because they want school districts to assess the member town for the school choice tuition that Old Colony is going to have removed through the Chapter 70 function that I just talked to you about. Okay. DESE says Old Colony will receive a certain amount of Chapter 70. Then we are going to take the money away from them to pay for these school choice children, right? Then we want Old Colony to assess the member town the school choice child came from to make Old Colony whole.
Let's add another level of bureaucracy.
It's very complicated, and the goal was to be fair here. So
Somebody muted me. I was wondering why you weren't answering me. Is this the first year that they're doing this?
we had school choice children in the past. It has not affected us to the degree that it's going to this year.
Right. Well, this came up, if I remember right, probably about 4 or 5 years ago.
Yes.
Is this, and now they're just finally slamming it to us, is what's going on.
No, we have new kids now.
No, but I mean, they wanted the money to come out of our district to pay for those kids.
Yep.
We talked about this about 4 or 5 years ago, and I thought they finally just let it slide and killed it. Apparently, we're getting slammed with it this year.
This is, and we are, we have 3. I mean, I talked with other business managers for other vocational school districts that have 60.
Yeah, well, I can imagine.
So
Yeah.
Can be big. It depends on what programs are offered in your area and that type
Right,
of thing.
because there was talk once before, the kids go to where Aaron came from. I'm sorry, I'm losing it.
That's a little different, Mo, but we did a few years ago. You are correct. We had a student who went to Taunton, and then this year it's Taunton and 2 at Wareham.
Yeah.
Yeah, Wareham for marketing.
Marketing.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so all of these pieces factor in to our assessment sheet. So I want to just line everybody up so that when we talk about our assessment sheet, everybody knows why it looks the way it looks. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Go to the next sheet. I'm going to skip this for a minute. We're going to go to page 5. Page 5. Thanks, Aaron, for having me page number these.
Yes.
Page 5.
All of this.
Page 5 is December 8th. We had a scenario put together of a draft budget. Page 5 and page 6 are what we normally do, which is we take whatever draft we had that we agreed we were comfortable moving forward with, and we populate that draft with the state aid figures. Okay, so I just want everybody to have this as a foundation for this conversation. Page 5 is the breakdown of the budget that we discussed in December with the application of the state aid numbers that were released in January. So we have applied funds of Chapter 70. We have the negative amount of school choice sending tuition. The reason the amount is $14,910 and not $15,000 is because Old Colony got $30 per pupil. So, in an attempt to be as fair as possible, the bill for a school choice sending student, and it's not a real bill, it's just they take it from our Chapter 70 revenue, is $5,000 per student. But Old Colony is actually receiving the minimum aid for that student. So I subtracted $30 from each one of those bills to come up with a total bill of $14,910. Then I have the transportation reimbursement aid per our cherry sheet and the transportation fund offset, which some of these things we knew in December, some of these things we were estimating in December, and these are the known as of January 27th. Then we move to our assessment sheet. The assessment sheet is now populated based on December 8th's meeting with minimum local contribution and a school choice sending tuition billed to the towns the student resides in. And you can see when I got down to the total increase on the assessment from one year to the next, it's obviously significantly higher than the meeting that we had on December 8th. And that was when I kind of said to Aaron, we're going to have a conversation about this because, you know, $300,000 from Acushnet and Lakeville is probably going to be difficult.
You think?
So we had a little chat. And Mr. Parker was involved. Mike got into the conversation and we had a talk. And so we come to you tonight with two drafts. The first draft includes a cut. The first cut is to health insurance. Now, health insurance is an estimate. I used the estimate of 7%. This is changed to an estimate of 5% increase on health insurance. And I think that will be around what we'll renew, but we haven't renewed yet. Gateway hasn't done their renewal. So with all of these, I think the most important piece is to understand and know as we proceed, if actual enrollment in health insurance changes and we have a large fluctuation of, let's just say, family plans, we may come to a situation where the school committee is having a conversation during FY22 about the appropriation for active employees in health insurance. It might happen. We haven't hit that yet. Since I've started at Old Colony, we've always come with an appropriation on active and retiree health insurance. So I'm hoping the 5% will be enough, but that was the first place to go in and sort of fine tune. And that was about a $47,000 savings or cut. The second place, and Mike and Aaron and I talked about this a lot, and I said, I'd rather trim down supplies a little bit for everyone before we start talking about anything deeper. So I said, let me do like the activity of going through, and if we just take a little bit from everyone, and when I say a little bit, I really mean just a small amount. It's like $1,000 here and $1,000 there, but it's every line. What's difficult about this is obviously Old Colony has really, over the last, I'd say 3 or 4 years, worked hard to increase supply lines and give the teachers what they need for the students. Obviously, in doing this cut of about $50,000 in supplies school-wide, it saves something else from being cut. So it's what's the lesser of two evils in this situation. And the third cut proposed in the second draft is to contracted services for special education. And again, that's not been something that we have heavily relied on in the past. However, I said this to Mike and Aaron, I want it to be very clear to the budget subcommittee. Moving forward, if we had a need, we would need to have a conversation about appropriating funds for that need.
Are all these things you just mentioned on this page? I'm not seeing them.
They are here. Oops, sorry.
Okay.
They're on page 4 at the bottom. Oops. Ugh. The proposed cuts are right here at the bottom.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So the proposed cut in the second draft is $123,938. And that is on page 4 at the bottom, outlines exactly what I just told you, each cut. And so those get us to a budget of $12,880,000 approximately, which is 1.98% increase on last fiscal year. So rounding up to a 2% increase on our budget. We had a 2.9% increase. So we shaved about 1% off of the increase that we are asking for in the total budget.
What page is that, Sarah, please?
Page 4. Page 4. We can go back up to those. I didn't want to get too deep into the different scenarios without going into it.
I was seeing page 5 there. That's why I was.
Yeah,
Okay,
page 4,
thank
right
you.
at the top. So right at the top
Yep.
of page 4, you've got your first draft and what we were looking for. The second draft includes the $123,000 cut. And there's another draft that we're going to talk about tonight, which is the application of ESSER to funds. So basically, the $123,000 cut to the FY22 budget brings the increase to member town assessments from $980,000 to $856,000. That cuts like just to the chase of what that cut to our budget, the effect that it has on assessment, which is really why we did the activity, because we could see the assessment. It was just, there was no way that we were going to be able to pass that budget. So let's go to the assessment sheet now. So keep in mind, we have cut the budget from a $13 million budget to a $12,880,000 budget. Sorry about my dollars and my numbers. $123,000 cut brings the total assessment variance down to $856,000 increase in assessment, total assessment. And then you can sort of see Acushnet and Lakeville come down below that $300,000 mark, where they were, you know, significantly above it before. Does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns? Okay. The next scenario gets a little bit more complicated because it is an application of ESSER2 funds. Very, very recently released by the state. School districts have the option, in collaboration with the town, to use ESSER2 funds to offset minimum local contribution. We can use 75% of our ESSER2 funds, up to, but not exceed. The remaining funds are a grant. The grant has to be written for COVID-related items, including but not limited to mental health, sanitation, being able to continue education of the students in a remote atmosphere, offering a summer program. There are many options for this grant. Our total grant is about $150,000. I believe it's $153,000. Okay. So this exercise applies that funding to minimum local contribution, lowering the increase of minimum local contribution to $670,000, lowering the total assessment increase to $748,000, with the understanding that these funds are offsetting operating revenue, operating expenses for Old Colony. Most of the time when grants are given, they are for things above and beyond your operating revenue, your operating expenses. So if we choose this draft option scenario, it has to be with the understanding to our member towns that this $107,000 is not a cut from our budget. That the following fiscal year, their minimum local contribution will be that plus the 107 that we have given them this year for this ESSER2 funds, plus whatever enrollment increase occurs at Old Colony. And I do believe ESSER2, when you read the language that is trickling down from the state, and there's a lot of unanswered questions still about how the revenue will come to Old Colony. So I've asked a few people, I haven't got any answers yet, and hopefully we'll learn sooner than later. Use of these funds, it's very important that that our member town understand that they would be back to, you know, that $778,000 increase next year as a starting point for Old Colony.
Sarah, can you go back to page 1 and show where the ESSA money?
Yes, absolutely.
Just so that people can see that it is, it's there for everyone to see.
Number 14.
Yes, it's that 13, 14, 15, 16 is a calculation in the allocation of available funds to be used to offset minimum local contribution. If anyone is interested in reading the little blurb that was reported on DESI Finance, I can pull it up. It's up to you guys. I don't know that it's relevant right now, but we're processing a lot of information in this meeting. It's a lot.
I can see that. I keep picturing, it's one thing to try to explain all of this to FinCom and select people. It's quite another to try to explain it on town meeting floor when I'm just seeing this now, and I can't say that I fully understand it. That's explaining on town meeting floor is going to be very challenging.
I will say that up until this point, Old Colony representatives haven't been asked to explain much on town meeting floor, but we will have a conversation with town representatives. So whether it's, we should talk to town administrators and FinCom members so that they have a full understanding of what this is, so that when it comes to town meeting floor, there aren't usually a lot of questions for Old Colony. What's most important is that the town administrators and the FinCom members understand what these things mean for the future, present and future.
Yes, and I agree with you. I think Old Colony has always taken, especially in the last number of years, taken a great position of calling in the, and actually even going back beyond the last few years, calling in the stakeholders and explaining things to them so that they understand. I think it's a terrific thing to do. However, it may come to pass that the town meeting, if the FinCom and select people can't balance all of their budgets, then it's going to be, it will be one department versus another. And then it becomes necessary, and I've always felt this way. I think in Freetown, Lakeville, they have had their superintendent do all of the explaining about the budget. And I think I've always felt that the school committee people should play a role in that explanation. And I guess my point is that right now, I don't feel terribly confident in understanding all of this.
I understand that. Thank you. I understand.
I'm beginning to have a little bit of an understanding of what Shirley was mentioning at the beginning of what you and Aaron must have been through in the last several weeks. And I'm sure I only understand it a little bit, but this is a lot to take in. They've thrown a lot of curveballs and spitters and what have you at us.
Well, I think it is a lot. I know the last 2 or 3 years, you and I have sat next to one another at the town meeting.
Right.
And I promise I'll wear a mask this year if it's in person. But I think I always attend, and dependent upon the date, Sarah is a wealth of knowledge. It really depends on her availability. But anytime Sarah speaks to a budgetary issue, it brings me to a place of calm. And I've said to her on numerous occasions that I'm grateful for the way she's able to break something complicated down. But I will share with you that even for me, there are things where I say, Sarah, I am so sorry, but I don't have the mind that she has. And sometimes the processing of it, when you're not doing it every day, is not as easy.
It is not.
So we're lucky to have her, but I think that we can prepare accordingly. And it certainly wouldn't be a lengthy explanation, to the extent that we're hearing tonight, but we can create an abbreviated explanation that may be easier to deliver, even with some notes that can be made available.
Absolutely.
I was going to say not just notes, but maybe audio
A
visual
narrative,
materials that can be projected. And I don't mean just a sheet of numbers like this.
Yes.
I think it has to be a little bit more user friendly.
We get the boring stuff here. But I agree with you.
Bob,
Is
to your
Sarah,
point-
is this Esther
I'm sorry.
2 allocation available every year?
No.
Is this a one-shot deal?
Yes.
So this is a kicking a can down the road.
Right, that's what I was wondering. Plus, I was wondering, okay, they're gonna want to know what we would have charged without it, I'm sure. And then next year, if it would have to start at a higher level, if it was available again,
And unfortunately, the funding and the language that has been provided for this ESSER2 funding grant
Right.
goes along the same lines of the conversation that we began with, which is that in towns, the enrollment has gone down for their
Yep.
local public school. And this, according to DESE, is an attempt to help that temporary, what they hope is a temporary burden. We don't know yet, and DESE made it very clear to Aaron and I that they can't and won't be able to speak to next year until they see the October 1, 21 numbers of students enrolled in school. And so we kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place where we have to make a decision for Old Colony. We have to pass a budget with our member towns, and we may potentially be using funding that we will never see again in the future. And we have no idea what state aid will be next year. And they made it very clear they're not going to speak on it until they see October 1 numbers.
Okay. Thank you. Good. I said if it was available next year, but it'll probably, even if they do, they probably will start with a higher, district contribution than what we have now. And so it could be worth, or we're less eligible for it. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I wonder if we decide to use that 75% ESSER 2 money, is there anything for COVID relief that is not being purchased, or we won't be able to consider purchasing it or refunding? And what are our needs in that area?
That's a great question. The school has done a great job, I think, our facilities director and our nutrition coordinator of that program, and even our athletics director very recently, to be prepared for potential changes going down the road, of prepping and having stock of items needed for COVID. This grant is different, where right from the beginning, you have to spend a certain amount of money on mental health. That's very unique.
$10,000 allocation
$10,000
earmarked for mental health.
The other piece is Old Colony has the COVID nurse that we feel is best to have that be grant funded if we can write it into this ESSER2 grant, as well as the part-time custodian that's been helping to clean the building. And we do have some funds spent for COVID supplies and relief that were not covered by our first round of entitlement for COVID that we would need to write to this. So there are potential items that we would have to buy that we might have to transfer for our current year's appropriation to cover those funds, those expenses, which we did that large pre-buy last year.
Right.
With the goal in mind, right, that if we had an emergency this year, we could act on those funds.
Is there any penalty if we were to use the 75% or any portion of it? Is there any penalty in a following year? And you probably don't know the answer to this, but you know better than I. Any penalty for schools who do use that to reduce assessments?
I haven't heard of that.
Yeah.
Not yet. So
My
I'm still
my
learning.
thinking would be that someone on the state level might look at that as saying, well, you know, the COVID money is supposed to be used for COVID related, and here we are using it in the assessment or to lower the assessment, and therefore maybe you don't need as much COVID money next year. I mean, who knows when this is going to end? We don't have. We hope the vaccine works. It's just a question that rolled around the back of my mind.
I haven't heard anything yet.
Okay.
You know, and the language for use of funds to offset minimum local contribution speaks to both the town and the region having a say. Doesn't say it must, says it may, shall, may.
So
May.
So would we have to have, you say the town has a say, would we have to have a unanimous vote by all the member towns?
No, we don't have to have a vote.
Just the school committee?
The school committee, in conversations with the town in preparation of the budget, it's a collaborative effort with this. So my understanding of it is that if the town says, no, don't use the ESSER2 funds to offset minimum local contribution, use it for your COVID expenses, then we could proceed as such. But the language that's come down from the state, this is suggested to offset the large shift in enrollment from local school districts, local towns.
So they're actually suggesting this almost on a, I want to say, a positive nature.
I don't
Deemed allow. I think it's
Suggested
fair to
isn't
say.
the right word.
I think it's fair to say it's been deemed allowable by the governor.
Yes,
Is that fair?
yes.
And then there are folks that have shared concerns similar to what Sarah articulated in response to Mr. St. Amand when he asked, is this a one-time only?
Right.
Because much like we are taught, and I smile as I say that because these are things I'm learning, much like we are taught that we don't take temporary offsets to
Right.
fund operations, we've been given that same advice to proceed with caution and to make sure that any use is very transparently communicated with our town so that they don't expect a similar offset in future years. So that's a really important piece of this puzzle.
Just for the reference to the actual language, I've put it up on my screen and shared it with the group. In the case of a municipality's increased required contribution as a member of a regional school district, the municipality may deem a proportionate share of 75% of the regional school district's ESSER2 grant award, equal to the municipality's share of the district's total required contribution, which is a calculation I performed to populate the assessment sheet, to satisfy the increase in its required contribution.
Okay.
And this is straight from Chapter 70 website for this year, for FY22. So it's allowable.
Okay.
And in this, it says the municipality may deem.
Well, that's as positive as I think the state ever gets. I'm thankful that they threw it out there as an option.
The only moving forward, obviously, is we go back to whole next year.
Right.
And that has to be a clear understanding because there will be change to our foundation enrollment moving forward.
Sarah, can I talk just a little about the ESSER fund?
Sure.
You received the exercise that included the ESSER fund because I asked that Aaron and Sarah prepare one. My concern was when you look at that Chapter 70 sheet that I had asked Sarah to put back up, it is clearly stated there what the ESSER fund, the dollar amounts of it. Okay, so back to line 1314. When I had heard the governor's release of his budget, it was the first time that I had really played, I was home, and I've increased the ESSER fund, whether he did it or he didn't, to offset local contributions. So I'm sitting here thinking, the anticipation, the intent of that 107, almost 108, to me, it seems to be pretty clear. And in a year that our towns are being hit so heavily in an increase to the assessment, why wouldn't we use it? And I think that's where I've been stuck, because we have been asked in the past, and we've gotten away from it mercifully, how much do we have in E&D? What do we have in this? What do we have in that? And here is an available fund to offset the increases to the required local contributions. Again, I think we're duty bound to use it unless we have a real good reason not to. So I had asked that the application be done. You can see how it does decrease the assessments with the ESSER funds. And Bob, to your point about town meeting floor, I think what will be important at town meeting floor is that we have presented a reasonable budget that does not grow beyond 2%. If we were to move more than that, we begun to make inroads to staffing and programming that we do not feel is responsible. So that's why the ESSER is here. It was to give an option, and I just feel my inclination is that we need to use the ESSER funds as I believe it was intended to, with the disclaimer to town officials, know that that money may not be available, and what you save today, you may owe tomorrow and then some. It's a lot to chew on, and I've had a few more days to chew on it than what you guys have.
Chewing's one thing, digesting is another.
So Sarah, can you go back to the exercise with the ESSER fund? Because we really didn't go into then what happens to the assessment and stuff.
Sure.
And how you got there.
Absolutely. So with the application of, we will call it the ESSER grant revenue, which would be incoming to Old Colony, we would keep the budget the same. That 12,880 that was presented in the second draft, that is the budget that we would work with. So that's $12,880,000. It's a 1.98% increase on the prior year. That would be the budget. Funding, you saw what the funding looked like in the previous slides. We've got our Chapter 70. We've got our school choice sending tuition that will be paid, regional transportation reimbursement per the cherry sheet, regional transportation fund offset, and ESSER grant. Those are Old Colony's revenue sources. All of that brings you to the assessment sheet, which you see here. And then you can see by town what the assessment variance is. When you apply the ESSER grant, the assessment variance decreases for all member towns by their proportionate share of minimum local contribution. Bringing the total assessment variance, the total increase ask, down to $748,000. That's an increase to Acushnet of $267,000. Carver is an $80,000 increase. Lakeville is $249,000. Mattapoisett is $151,000, and Rochester would go down $1,800. And when you look at the enrollment variance, it fits well. Just there are the question marks for next fiscal year, obviously. So, you know, that a member town's minimum local contribution and assessment might mirror their growth or decline in enrollment at Old Colony. This starts to look a little bit more like the puzzle pieces fit together better for the ask for FY22 from Old Colony.
So Sarah, if I may, am I correct if at the bottom of that sheet, the FY22 per pupil tuition, if you want to use that word, for Lakeville is $16,405 per student, is that correct?
That's before Chapter 70 funding. Our Chapter 70, a proportionate share of our Chapter 70 is for Lakeville students. So if you add that Chapter 70 in for those Lakeville students, Lakeville's per pupil for FY22 would be $23,066.
Okay, then I have to recalculate here. All right, so it's 100 of that 249. Am I doing the numbers right? About 190 of that is for new students only?
New students, and Lakeville's increase on minimum local contribution, which doesn't necessarily correlate directly to a per pupil at Old Colony.
Okay. I assume it's still illegal for us to print money in the print shop?
I mean, if you tell me there's a money tree to plant, somewhere, I mean, and I'm not a gardener, I'll go get my gloves and I'll get the dirt and
you know what? I'll become a gardener if that would solve the problem.
We are getting an update to a printer and graphics that could be helpful.
To those who may be listening, we are only joking, folks.
I'll
FBI and all that.
We love to kid. So that is our presentation, not mine, our. It is a collaborative effort. Aaron, Mike, myself, lots of conversations. That is our presentation to the budget subcommittee. It's up to you all if you want to think about these things and come back, or if you want to have a conversation about potentially accepting one of these scenarios tonight. It's up to you.
As far as schedules go, Carver's still set for their town meeting in April 13th, I think it is. So we're kind of on a, have to move forward schedule as the other years. So to accept, maybe possibly tonight, the second one prior to, and then meet with the finance committees and maybe go from there. So that would be my suggestion, that, we kind of have a schedule and this is what it is, and, onward and upward.
Well, I feel, go ahead, Aaron.
I was just going to say, I really, first of all, Sarah put a tremendous amount of work into this. I want to thank her for her efforts. Also, I'd like to thank Shirley for her feedback relative to the ESSER 2 funds, because I really think that given the fact that we're a smaller school and the allocation is much smaller than what bigger schools are seeing, as long as we're transparent with the fact that this is a one-time support, so to speak, and that the state has allowed for it, I think it's in our best interest to utilize that offset to support our member towns, because what we're seeing is increases that are far more significant than what they've seen in the past. And there are a number of different pieces to that puzzle. But the fact that we've come in now at under 2% feels really good to me. I can advocate with good faith on behalf of that. And we are also, I know we didn't speak to it too much, and I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but we have to remember that we're seeing a shift from a revenue source that came from Freetown that's been redistributed to our member towns. And that is a piece of the puzzle. That being said, I would make the recommendation that we utilize the last iteration with the ESSER 2 funds to support our member towns and bring that to our town representatives at a meeting not too far off in the future. I did speak to the Carver Town Administrator today. He knows we have a meeting this evening. And I think that folks are probably expecting to hear from us within the next week or so. So I think it would just be in our best interest to give them as much advance notice, to Dawn's point, as possible. So, if the subcommittee is in support of the ESSER 2 support iteration, I'll call it that, I'd like to make the recommendation that we propose that draft for feedback to our member towns and see what they have to say. Time to go back to the drawing board if need be.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I am reluctant to do that, but I think if we did not offer that, I think would be in worse shape. I think Aaron's correct, and I think I heard Shirley mention earlier that that was her inclination as well. And I would like to make that in the form of a motion that we put the ESSER 2 budget, if you will, or assessment, whatever we want to say, to the stakeholders in the towns. And I agree. I think the meeting should be not very far in the future, because the end of March comes very soon. And that's the time by which we have to approve a final budget. It's going to be difficult enough as it is. We don't want to squeeze ourselves in. So I would make that motion that we present the ESSER 2 format.
Bob, can I ask before we move forward a vote, why is there some reluctance on your part?
Well, it's kind of a kicking the can down the road type of thing. You can't use grant money as part of operations, and generally speaking, and that's what I see we're doing. We know we're going to face this next year, and that's my reluctance.
There's some hope that maybe next year, Chapter 70 monies, and that's what becomes the quandary of this year.
You got it.
We have no idea what next year will bring us.
Right.
So next year we pick up another 20 to 30 kids, and we'll have seen our enrollment go up in a 2-year span to maybe 50 kids? And do we get just $30 for them, or do we get what we probably feel as though a fair share of Chapter 70 monies?
What is
those?
Go ahead.
What's the general type of dollar figure per student that we would normally get instead of the 30? What would you normally look?
Our foundation Chapter 70 aid has been about $7,000 per student. $6,900, $700 per student, right around that.
Okay, and what is it now? I mean, it's an increase of 30, but what is that? I don't recall the.
It's an increase of 30 with a decrease of school choice sending. It's $6,600 per student.
But that's recalculated with the increased number too, Bob. So
Right, I'm using the new, yes.
we're using a new number that's 31 students greater.
Right.
So you're taking the former number of 7,029 and multiplying that by the 31 fewer students. Then you're adding your 31 to get to 498, and you're multiplying that by the 6,600. Is that correct, Sarah?
Opposite. So I took last year's Chapter 70, divided it by foundation enrollment, and applied the per pupil to this year's Chapter 70 initially. This year's Chapter 70 net sent school choice sending students, right? This year's Chapter 70 is 3,297, 3,297, divided by our new foundation enrollment, which is increased by 31 pupils.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to take that school choice sending tuition out because we're going to pay it. Actually end up being a lesser per pupil amount.
Right.
We have more pupils, we're getting less money.
Right. I think we just said it differently, but yeah,
Maybe.
600 at the 498.
Sarah, what are you adding back to that number with the 107,000 on a per pupil basis?
Not a per pupil, the 107,000. So
Yeah, but
basically,
if divided by the per pupil, what does it represent as a return?
the 107,
Yeah, I mean, it's not a lot. You have 400 kids
yeah,
into that number.
it's not a lot.
But I mean, if you take those two numbers and combine them and say, okay, next year that
Right.
money isn't available for this grant,
Right.
but they may flip it back into their Chapter 70 funds.
It's about $217 per pupil.
Yeah.
If Old Colony keeps picking up 25 kids for the next 2 years, how is that going to affect the other 5 towns? They have 344 less students. They're going to lose another 50. Is that going to keep cutting them on their end? Does that make any sense? Anybody? I don't know if I'm.
It does. We've already seen the start of it. I mean, I think realistically that there is significant interest in Old Colony. From an admissions perspective, we're seeing over 250 applications per class from member districts. And what that means is that's spread out amongst those 5 towns in ways that we can't predict, right? So this year we saw an increase of 15 students in Acushnet and 9 in Lakeville, which pretty much accounts for the differential from the students who were not coming in from the town of Freetown. What we've already seen trending, and I spoke to Shirley earlier today, was 51 applicants from Rochester. That's higher than what we've typically seen in the past. So the redistribution is unpredictable. The general cumulative distribution is somewhat predictable. What we're seeing is between 255 and 275 applications per year from our member towns. Is that helpful?
I know Carver is fighting tooth and nail to keep every student they can, and they're losing.
It's visible. The Carver applications are less.
Yeah.
A comment to Dawn's question, though, and I may not have understood it correctly, but Dawn, I think Sarah alluded to it in the beginning when she spoke of the drop in the community's K through 12 population. This year very well could have been an aberration year. Kindergarten parents may not have sent their kids to school this year. First or second graders may have said, no, not going to school, because for no other reason than the pandemic. And next year, hopefully that September rolls around and everybody is where they should be, we may see the countering of some of those shifts. That the enrollments that dropped in our elementary schools may turn around and pick up, which then in turn will create a lowering, maybe, of the required local contributions to Old Colony, and take that shift back to either the middle schools or elementary schools of the sending communities. So I don't know if that answers maybe where you were going with your question, Don.
Well, yes, to a point, because you don't know which way they're going. Some kids are, as you said, how many went to a Catholic school but they're paying, and next year will be free again. They'll go back the other direction. So it's,
Exactly.
It's hard to predict.
A lot of private and Catholic schools were able to take kids back full time because they had larger schools or more resources, or already had very small classes to begin with. So for working parents, they felt that was something they could handle. Well, I'm going to work every day. I'm going to send my kid to school every day, and withdraw them from the public school system. The question is, will they want to continue to pay the tuition to have their child attend that school? And there's no way to know if they'll keep going or if they'll come back to the public school system.
Are we ready for a second on the motion?
And just on the other hand, Tara, on that scenario, a lot of the Catholic schools, there's been quite a few that closed this past year. So those kids are back. Say some of them must be in public school. I'm sure they weren't all transferred to other Catholic schools as much as they probably would have liked to.
But Mo, you think about even that. When they transferred back, it was probably after October 1. When they were taking the census, they were coming back in November and December.
Well, I'm not. I can't say that for certain, but a lot of these Catholic schools they said they were closing. They weren't even going to open in September, so people were aware of it. So they had to, these kids had to start going and try to get into someplace.
As we've gone over the budget this year in this preparation, and I've been doing the budget here for I don't know how many years, nothing is normal. And that's an understatement.
Right.
That we're seeing aberrations over and over again. I don't ever remember talking about school choice kids.
Right.
And the impact on them. It has raised the question for me as, every now and then we'll have a year that our numbers aren't quite right. And, was that a school choice kid? Something like that. All I know is that everybody's feeling a strain this year. And I think we need to be as responsible as possible to present a budget that is fair both to the communities we serve and to our children and our students.
Definitely. That's right. Bob's made a motion, and I'd like Jolene read it back for us, please. And then we need a second. So we can.
I'll already second it, Joe.
You did?
I will now.
Well, I'd just like to hear it again, just to make sure.
My motion, Mo, was simply to, as Aaron outlined, was to put forward the ESSER 2 proposal, those numbers, to the FinCom, Board of Selectmen, stakeholders in the towns, town administrators, whomever, to present that to them, to let them see that, we've dropped the budget, we're using all available funds. And so, and speaking of that available funds, I want to talk about E&D afterwards. But that was my motion, to use the ESSER presentation with the stakeholders to get an idea of what their response is.
Thank you, Bob.
Yep.
Okay, that Shirley second that?
I will second that.
Okay, can we, all those in favor of that motion?
Aye.
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 Okay, no
Unanimous.
opposed? I believe we had everybody.
Can I just ask, can we pick a date? Because I'd like to try and do this as soon as possible with enough time for people to prepare. I had a couple dates in mind and I'll just throw them out there and people can tell me what they. One is February 18th, which is next Thursday. The other one was February 22nd, which is next, the following Monday. And that was-
22nd, I'm at a Board of Selectmen's meeting.
Okay. And if you're there, then they're there, so that's not a good date for them.
Right.
Is the 18th,
18th is okay for me.
is that okay?
Yeah.
Because we could get something out as soon as tomorrow with notification that we'd like to meet on the 18th via Zoom and invite them and take it from there.
Are we doing this in-house or are we doing all of it Zoom
I think it should be Zoom.
in
Because
its entirety?
hybrid gets too messy.
Okay.
And I don't think we've still squared away our audio issues when we meet in a hybrid.
This is very clean. I like what happened tonight.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll aim for the 18th as long as there's no objection.
Well, that sounds fine on this end for me, if everybody else is okay.
I'll be sitting here.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, I'm okay.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, one question I had in terms of all available funds. I know for the past number of years, there's been a certain figure that we've used to carry forward in E&D. And I'm sure if I asked you, Sarah, what will our E&D be, you wouldn't be able to say. But is our plan to use that same figure to bring forward and to hold as E&D is, I guess, what I'm saying.
So the procedure of the school committee has been, once the E&D is certified, and I do believe it will be right around 500,000, which we've certified the last few years. There will be a vote by the school committee to appropriate a portion of those funds to OPEB and stabilization. The procedure of the school committee has been to keep at least $150,000 in E&D. We have also annually, I think the past 3 years, made capital purchases from E&D. That has been the procedure in the past.
Okay, thank you. That's what I was looking for. Thank you. I mean, obviously, you can't predict what the school committee is going to do, but you know what your recommendations will be. Have an idea.
It's good procedure to
Yeah.
fund OPEB and stabilization, continuing to do that. It will make a huge difference if we proceed with a building project as well. We won't be able to borrow if we don't have fund balance. So we will need E&D and we will need stabilization, and they will absolutely look at our OPEB in order to decide what sort of rate we might have
Right.
to borrow. But I believe Old Colony couldn't bond back when, back way when. We had no E&D balance. So it's healthy and good to have a fund balance moving forward and for the district. And we've always, at least for the past 3 or 4 years, when we've had a healthy E&D balance, voted on some of these large capital purchases that we haven't incorporated in our budget. Our capital purchases in our operating budget, very small, $50,000 minimum.
Right. I would anticipate when we meet with our stakeholders, this might be a question that they ask, what do you anticipate and how do you plan to use it and so forth. So we should be prepared for that.
Okay. And the other point I would like to leave everyone with is we will come back together and talk about the FY21 budget and a plan for the end of the year, a plan for potential OPEB and stabilization funding because we didn't do that last spring. And I didn't want to give everyone that tonight because I knew tonight was going to be a long meeting, but we will have to come back and talk about that. We'll take it one step at a time.
Right.
One of the
Yeah.
things for the 18th, if we could have in our back pocket, that second scenario without the ESSER funds, in the event the towns tell us you don't really need to use it, and we want to go that way, but I think the most transparent method is to go forward with the vote of tonight, the ESSER funds.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Yeah, it can't hurt, Shirley.
Well, it would be there. I don't think, I would be very surprised if they told us.
That makes two of us.
I mean, just to create a little perspective, I was just looking back at FY21 and Mattapoisett had the highest number in terms of a variance of like 7 point something percent. And when you look at this year, the only town that's lower than 7 point something percent is Rochester. Everybody else is above. And that to me, you know, when Sarah was kind of sharing numbers, and again, I'm just trying to, like you said, Bob, you try to grasp as much as you can. And I think a comparative analysis lends perspective. And when we started to plug in the ESSER funds, we saw Carver drop to 6 point something percent in terms of their variance. And that to me felt a little bit better because I had just talked to Rick LaFond today about the fact that they budget a 5% increase. So even the 6 is a little bit above what I think they've budgeted in Carver. So I think that idea is a great idea, Shirley. I wonder what the result will be, but we'll see. We'll keep our.
Well, for Lakeville, going from 14.1 to 12.49, I'm not sure even how the 12.49 will be received. I have to think that that's going to be problematic as well, but it's certainly not as problematic as 14.
And I think we also have to remember, as we're advocating, that money follows students. And we did have a meeting in December of 2019.
Right.
We very clearly articulated that with the loss of Freetown revenue, we will see an increase in our assessments. And that's a really important piece of the puzzle. You know, I think to not state that is to miss a huge piece of the puzzle.
That's true.
If I may add one more, the percentage increase in our member towns' assessment is actually less than the percentage increase in their minimum local contribution because we are applying these ESSER funds. So at the end of the day, if we were to just go with the DESI numbers, the percentage increase is actually higher. The minimum local contribution went up at a rate more than what we're asking for from their assessment.
So you're saying the minimum contribution is more the culprit
Absolutely.
than what we've discussed here tonight.
Lakeville's minimum local contribution has increased 16%, and we are asking for an increase of 12% because we're using those ESSER funds.
Right. And even if we weren't, it would be 14.1. So even that's lower, is your point. Yeah.
Because we're trying to work with our operating budget without affecting student learning every day.
Yeah, I'm not sure that would necessarily make much difference at town meeting. But again, let's not put the cart before the horse, and we'll have a better understanding after this meeting on the 18th if we can get it together.
And I think the big thing to remember is to Shirley's point earlier, 1.98% is a very responsible budget. And we're cutting supply lines, to Sarah's point, that we've worked very hard to build. And we're looking at ways that we can mitigate what was a 2.9 and bring it to a 1.98, which is a very reasonable number. I feel comfortable advocating, and that's our job, is to advocate on behalf of our students and our families.
Right.
And I think that I don't want to give them less. I don't want to start looking at cutting. You know, it's one thing if we saw a decrease in our enrollment. We have not seen a decrease in our enrollment. We've seen an increase in our enrollment, and that's a really important piece of the puzzle. not only our foundation enrollment, but our overall enrollment. And that's real too. So to start to cut a budget to a great extent could have a drastic impact on the level of service that we provide. So I'm very proud of what we've put together, and I think I can stand behind it with confidence.
Any more questions? Call the meetings adjourned.
Thank you.
Good
Thank
night,
you.
everyone.
Sarah and Aaron, really nice job. Sarah, I can only imagine, for both of you really, how much time you put in on this. And I think I almost understand what you were saying tonight.
Awesome.
And, almost, but that's on me, not you.
That's scary.
God, it is scary.
Thank
Have
you.
a good night, folks.
Thank you. You too.